Here is part 2 of settling the West. Now, the second act that President Abraham Lincoln passed with the worry of possibly having issues of slavery moving west was the Pacific Railway Act. It was pivotal in helping settlers move west more quickly, as well as move their farm products and later cattle and mining deposits back east. The first of many railway initiatives, this act commissioned the Union Pacific Railroad to build a new track west from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific Railroad moved east from Sacramento, California. So this law provided each company with ownership of all public lands within 200 feet on either side of the track laid, as well as an additional land grant and payment through load bonds. So it is because of these provisions, both companies made significant profit, whether they were crossing hundreds of miles of open plains or working their way through the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. So as a result, you have the creation of the nation's first Transcontinental Railroad. It was completed when the two companies connected their tracks. Here they are in this map. You can see what the red is going to be the Union Pacific, and the blue is the Central Pacific, okay, and they connect. A lovely other map. They connected the final spike. It's not there anymore. Obviously, they nailed it in and then they pulled it out, and it's now in a museum. But it is put in at Promontory Point. Okay, Promontory Point, Utah, in the spring of 1869. Other tracks, including lines radiating from this original one, subsequently created a network that linked all corners of the nation. Now, as settlers spread across the continent, some 250,000 Native Americans, many of them originally from east of the Mississippi, are forced into what are considered to be their last refuge, right? The Great Plains and the mountain regions of the West. They end up on the reservation system. From the early 1860s until the 1870s, the Trans-Mississippi West, often called Indian Country, raged with what were so-called Indian Wars. Although the U.S. government had signed numerous treaties with the nations giving them ownership of reservation lands, those commitments were repeatedly violated by buffalo hunters, miners, ranchers, farmers, railroad surveyors, and horse soldiers. In the 1860s, the federal government ousted numerous tribes from the lands they had been promised would be theirs forever. So, the popular image of the Wild West in books, television, and films has been one of violence and mayhem for the Wild West. The lure of quick riches through mining and driving cattle meant that much of the West did indeed consist of rough men living a hard life, although the violence was exaggerated and even glorified in the dime store novels of the day. The exploits of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and others made for good stories, but the reality was that Western violence was more isolated than the stories might suggest. These clashes often occurred as people struggled for the scarce resources that could be make or break their chances at survival. So, as the settlers pushed westward, they inevitably would come into conflict with tribes that had been living on the land. Although the threat of the attack was quite slim and nowhere proportionate to the number of U.S. Army actions directed at them, the occasional attack, often one of retaliation, was enough to fuel the popular fear and imagery of a savage. Okay, these clashes, when they happened, were indeed brutal, and most of the brutality occurred at the hands of the settlers. Ultimately, the settlers, with the support of local militia and later with the federal government behind them, sought to eliminate these tribes from the lands that they desired. So the result is devastation for Native Americans. They lack the weapons and group coercion to fight back against well-armed forces. So manifest destiny spelled the end of Native American way of life. Now, here on this map you can see the different Native American reservations. The yellow is 1875, the maroon is 1900. You can see they are shrinking, and this is due to manifest destiny. Now, George Custer and the 7th Cavalry were sent out into the Black Hills to look for gold. There had been rumors that there was gold there, so Custer was sent out to look for it. Now, he does subsequently find it, which is going to lead to a clash in issues, more specifically, really the last major clash between American soldiers and Native Americans occurred near the end of the 19th century. What it is, in the late 1888, Jack Wilson, or Wovoka, had a delirium where he imagined being in the spirit world and that they were having a deliverer that was coming to rescue the Indians and restore their land. So they began having ghost dances to enliven and perform these ceremonial dances so that the Savior would come quicker. The ghost dance movement sped very rapidly, and in 1890, the Western Sioux adopted the practice with such passion that it alarmed authorities. It actually ended up being made illegal to do the dance. Now, with the subsequent discovery of gold in the Black Hills, settlers seeking their fortune began to move upon the newly granted Sioux land with support from U.S. cavalry troops. Okay. By the middle of 1875, thousands of white prospectors were illegally digging and panning in the area. The Sioux protested the invasion of their territory and the violation of sacred grounds, because it was sacred grounds. Now, the government offered to lease the Black Hills or to pay $6 million if they were willing to sell the land. Clearly they were not. It was sacred land. The government imposed on what it considered a fair price for the land, ordered them to move, and in the spring of 1876 made ready to force them onto the reservation. This is the Battle of Little Bighorn, perhaps the most famous battle of the American West. A Sioux chieftain, Sitting Bull, urged natives from all neighboring tribes to join his men in defense of their lands. And at Little Bighorn River, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry, led by George Custer, sought a showdown. Driven by his own personal ambition, on June 25th, 1876, Custer foolishly attacked what he thought was a minor Native American encampment. He was wrong. Instead, it turned out to be the main Sioux force. The Sioux warriors, nearly 3,000 in strength, surrounded and killed Custer and 262 of his men and support units in the single greatest loss of U.S. troops to Native American attacks in the era of Western expansion. Eyewitness reports of the attack indicated, though, that the vicious Sioux bathed and wrapped Custer's body in the tradition of a chieftain burial. Now, despite their success at Little Bighorn, neither the Sioux nor any other Plains tribe followed this battle with any other armed encounter. Rather, they returned to tribal life or fled out of fear of the remaining troops. Sitting Bull himself fled to Canada, although he would return later in 1881 and subsequently work in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. So, the final episode of the so-called Indian would occur in 1890 at the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Okay, it all started with an accident. I will discuss it at a later date, but understand what it is. Sitting Bull had been arrested, shot, and killed in 1890, and the Sioux tribe was ready to surrender December 29th, 1890 and all. Though the accounts are unclear, it is said that they were setting down weapons when an accidental discharge went off and U.S. soldiers began to fire indiscriminately upon Native Americans. they killed between 150 and 300 men, women, and children. So, also understand the romanticization images tell only a part of the story. Drudgery and tragedy were commonplace. In contrast to the Hollywood versions of the West, settlers were of a diverse lot, and there was a lot of bad things that happened. Okay? The abuse, displacement, and relocation of Native Americans and the rapid dwindling of buffalo herds coincided with the burgeoning cattle industry in the West. Cattle are herded into these grasslands where buffalo had once roamed. For many years, wild cattle first brought to America by the Spanish had competed with the buffalo. Breeding them with Anglo-American domesticated cattle produced the longhorn. There was overhunting as well. But this gives rise to the cattle industry. Okay, so a few entrepreneurs begin to imagine how the expansion of the railroad might establish a market. The junction is in Abilene, Kansas. Once the rail line reached Kansas and Missouri, a livestock dealer, McCoy, recognized the possibilities of driving vast herds of cattle raised in Texas to Kansas, and then they would be loaded onto train cars and sent elsewhere, typically back east. Now this gives rise to the cattle industry in Chicago. It makes it the fastest growing city in the nation. Located on Lake Michigan and served by several riders and rivers and 9 railroads in 1865, Chicago was the gateway to the Western economy. So, within a few years, you have this huge development of the cattle industry being pumped into Chicago from the meatpacking industry, right? Now, understand though as well that barbed wire, as it says on this slide, barbed wire and windmills are leading to ranching, but also the end of the open range. It was 1873, Joseph Glidden, an Illinois farmer, developed the first effective and inexpensive form of barbed wire fencing. So it triggers a range war where small ranchers fought to retain the open range, but in the end, barbed wire wins. So that is the end of settling into the West.